The year is 64 CE. A woman stumbles through the moonlit streets of ancient Rome, her body covered in filth and blood. Chains rattle at her feet as thousands of voices erupt around her. The smell of smoke and iron fills the air. But what's about to happen to her will make even the cruelest legends of Rome seem merciful. Because tonight, Rome will remind the world that power, once worshipped, can become the purest form of evil. By the end of this story, you'll understand why historians tried to erase these events from the record, why entire generations were taught only half the truth. Make sure to subscribe before we begin, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from, because this isn't just ancient history. What you're about to see still echoes in our world today. They tell us Rome built civilization, law, art, architecture, order. But behind the marble and the triumphal arches hid something unspeakable. A theater of cruelty designed not for justice but for domination. Public punishment in Rome wasn't a sentence. It was a performance. The empire understood that terror worked best when it felt like entertainment. Crowds gathered not merely to witness death, but to feel the thrill of it, to see human dignity stripped away one layer at a time. What you're about to learn will reveal 3 disturbing truths. First, how Rome transformed execution into a ritual of public pleasure. Second, the particular offense that sealed a person's fate in the arena. And third, why emperors themselves attended these horrors, often with smiles carved on their faces. Imagine the city at its height between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, when half the known world answered to Rome. The streets glittered with marble temples, and speeches about virtue echoed through the forum. But beneath that grandeur was a system built on fear. Rome had perfected not just the art of killing, but the art of breaking the human spirit. It wasn't enough to destroy the body. They had to erase the person. When the empire condemned someone, the punishment was more than execution. It was annihilation of identity. Family ties, memories, even the idea of self were crushed under spectacle. Historians speak quietly about these rituals, if at all. Because the truth is too ugly, Rome turned humiliation into policy. It was psychological warfare disguised as justice. The condemned were displayed, mocked, and marched through the streets, not only to die but to vanish as human beings. Picture it. The air of the city reeks of sweat and decay. The crowd swells like a living beast, its heartbeat drumming through the stones. From far away comes the clang of metal, the sound of chains scraping against the ground. Guards drag a prisoner through the forum. Her crime could be anything: defiance, rumor, or simply being in the wrong man's way. She isn't just being executed. She's being erased. Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But before the arena, there was the parade. At every corner, the crowd hurled whatever they could: mud, waste, stones. Symbols of disgust meant to strip away her humanity. And yet, this cruelty wasn't chaos. It was carefully choreographed. Each stop along the route was chosen for maximum pain. Outside temples she once prayed in, near her family's home, through markets where her name had once been spoken with respect. Rome knew that a body could be destroyed only once, but dignity could be murdered again and again. Eyewitnesses wrote about how some prisoners tried to cover themselves, to hide their shame. Guards broke their fingers. Others tried to fall to the ground. They were lifted and forced to walk. The lesson was clear: no defiance, not even the instinct to protect one's own, would be tolerated. And the most chilling part? Families were expected to watch. Parents brought their children, calling it education. The condemned's own relatives were sometimes ordered to participate, to throw stones, to shout curses, because refusing meant joining the parade themselves. Rome didn't just rule by the sword, it ruled through spectacle. By turning punishment into a ceremony, the empire transformed fear into loyalty. The guards weren't mindless brutes. They were trained in precision cruelty, pausing at every chosen spot, forcing the crowd to linger on each moment of degradation. It wasn't enough that the body suffered. The soul had to feel itself breaking, piece by piece. But that march was only the beginning. What awaited inside the arena would make everything before seem almost merciful. The gates creaked open and slammed shut like the mouth of a monster. 50,000 Romans filled the stands, their cheers rolling like thunder. This wasn't a battle of gladiators or beasts. This was theater, a ritual meant to feed the empire's hunger for control. The condemned were dressed to resemble characters from legend, forced to act out scenes of betrayal, guilt, and divine punishment. Myth and punishment became one. To the crowd, it was poetry. To the condemned, it was the slow erasure of everything human. Writers like Cassius Dio recorded how even members of the nobility could fall victim when they threatened imperial power. He described how an empress once condemned for treason was paraded before the people, not to be executed swiftly, but to endure every cruelty Rome had invented. Her fall wasn't a punishment for a crime. It was a warning to everyone who might dare to think they were safe. You might think this is all ancient history, but look closer. The machinery that made Rome's spectacles possible, fear, humiliation, and the public's thirst for dominance, has never truly disappeared. We've just changed the stage lights. Every empire, every age, has found its own version of the Colosseum, a place where suffering becomes entertainment and empathy turns to silence. And that's why this story matters now. Because when we forget what power does unchecked, we risk repeating the same theater, one humiliation at a time. So if you've made it this far, take a moment to think about what you've seen. The Romans built monuments that still stand today, but their greatest legacy might be the blueprint for cruelty that still shapes our world. If you're ready to keep uncovering the darkest corners of history, the truths others buried, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Because as long as we keep looking into the shadows of the past, maybe we can stop them from repeating in the light. First, they stripped her before a crowd of senators. Then, they forced her to crawl across the arena floor on her hands and knees as the audience hurled objects and insults. But that was only the beginning. The ritual had a name: supplicium, the ceremony of ultimate destruction. It wasn't about killing a person. It was about systematically dismantling everything that made them human. This wasn't mere execution. It was transformation, turning a living being into a symbol of fear. Rome's spectacles were crafted with precision. Every gesture, every humiliation, every gasp from the crowd was part of an unspoken message. This is what happens when you challenge the empire. But here's the detail most history books leave out. The spectators weren't just passive witnesses. They were participants. The people of Rome decided the pace of agony. They voted with their gestures. A signal from the stands could determine whether the condemned suffered longer or was granted a merciful end. And mercy was rare. Roman parents used these displays as lessons. Mothers whispered to their daughters about obedience. Fathers lectured their sons about dominance and control. Even the emperor's box offered more than a view. It was a stage throne, symbolizing the absolute power to decide between pain and peace. This wasn't simply entertainment. It was a political instrument, a live demonstration of imperial authority, teaching every Roman citizen what rebellion cost. And the most chilling part? Many of the condemned remained conscious until their final breath, forced to experience their destruction as a public ceremony. But there was one group whose punishment eclipsed all others: women who were supposed to be sacred. Don't scroll yet. What you're about to hear, the story of the Vestal Virgins, will make every other punishment sound merciful by comparison. The Vestals were Rome's holiest women, priestesses of the eternal flame, believed to guard the spirit of the empire itself. For centuries, they were revered, feared, and untouchable, until the day they weren't. When one of them was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, Rome faced an impossible dilemma. To execute a sacred woman risked divine wrath. To spare her risked rebellion. So they created something far worse than death. Pliny the Younger wrote about it in letters hidden for generations. The ritual began before the full Senate. The accused Vestal, stripped of her title and dignity, stood trembling as Rome's most powerful men debated her worthiness to live. The ceremony lasted for hours. No blood was shed, not yet. Then came the punishment designed to satisfy both gods and men: burial alive. But this was no simple grave. Beneath the city, workers carved chambers just large enough for a person to survive for days. with a flickering lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water. Not enough to live, only enough to prolong the horror. The walls were rough, covered in jagged fragments of pottery. If she tried to escape, her hands would shred to bone. The chamber's narrow ceiling made every breath an effort. Witnesses above could hear muffled screams echoing through the stone for days, sometimes weeks. Families brought their children to listen, calling it a sacred lesson in obedience. One account describes a Vestal who survived 18 days before the lamp went out. 18 days of darkness, silence, and madness. When her body was finally discovered, priests called it divine will, and if by some miracle she lived, they executed her anyway, declaring survival itself a blasphemy. Emperor Domitian personally oversaw the design of these chambers. He ensured that the acoustics amplified every cry, calling it architectural theology, using sound itself to display divine justice. This was Rome at its most perverse, where faith and fear fused into architecture. And yet, the story doesn't end there, because emperors didn't just witness these horrors, they crafted them. Roman rulers turned execution into ritual art. Emperor Caligula personally choreographed punishments, treating them like grand performances. He spent weeks planning every detail, consulting architects, handlers, and magistrates to ensure the perfect display of suffering. And when foreign envoys came to Rome, they were invited to watch. It was political theater on an imperial scale. A live broadcast of terror meant to remind the world that resistance was futile. Caligula even commissioned a private arena beneath his palace. Archaeologists later discovered evidence suggesting these spaces were used to test new punishment sequences before they debuted in public spectacles. In his mind, cruelty wasn't chaos. It was statecraft. Nero took this obsession further. He blurred the line between emperor and executioner, turning the theater of pain into a stage for his own ego. To the cheering crowds, he declared himself the embodiment of divine judgment. His cruelty wasn't random, it was a deliberate political performance. And here's the most chilling truth of all. None of this was dismissed as madness. It was policy. The empire codified humiliation as an instrument of control. When rival queens or rebellious provinces defied Rome, their leaders weren't simply punished. They were humiliated publicly to warn others. Treaties began to include clauses about preserving dignity, as nations begged to avoid Rome's ritual punishments. Whole cultures changed their laws about women, fearful of Roman retaliation. The machinery of degradation had become as institutionalized as the army itself. There were even official positions, magistrates whose sole duty was to invent new forms of psychological torment. Their title, curator of public discipline. But then, something began to shift. As Christianity spread across the empire, whispers of doubt began to creep into Roman hearts. Citizens who had once cheered for cruelty began to question whether these spectacles truly pleased the gods. It wasn't sudden, the transformation took centuries, but the change was unstoppable. Gradually, the crowds thinned. The cheers faded. By the 4th century, the arenas stood empty. Rome didn't ban these horrors because of conscience or decree. It ended them because people finally stopped watching. And yet, what should terrify us most is how long it took. 3 centuries of moral evolution before the audience lost its appetite for human suffering. For generations, families had treated these atrocities as lessons, calling them culture, justice, religion. When archaeologists later uncovered private Roman homes, they found frescoes depicting these punishments painted on dining room walls. The spectacle of suffering had become home decor. Brutality wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. So what does this reveal about us, about civilization itself? Rome's legacy of ritual humiliation exposes a universal truth. Any society can normalize the unthinkable if power demands it. This wasn't the madness of a few tyrants. It was a carefully built system, bureaucratic and respected, that turned cruelty into tradition. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight: we still do it. The methods are different, but the impulse remains. Public shaming, viral humiliation, coordinated attacks, the digital coliseums of our age. The Romans convinced themselves they were civilized while cheering for agony. So ask yourself, what are we cheering for now? What do we consume as entertainment that future generations will call barbaric? I want to know what you think. Which civilizations in history do you believe repeated Rome's cycle of moral decay? And where do you see the shadows of Roman cruelty in our own world today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, make sure to subscribe, and let us know which city you're watching from. Because the more we understand the darkness of the past, the better chance we have of keeping it from returning.